Well, I'll tell you what, let's talk to Ross Clark, a man who knows a thing or two about the energy business. Wrote a book, of course, about net zero. We're going to talk to him about Europe in a second, but he's, of course, got a column in The Sun this morning on page 10, page 12, I should say. Very good morning to you, Ross.
Good morning, Mike.
Just before we get on to the subject of the Brussels trip by Sir Keir Starmer and him cozying up to European leaders, I just thought I'd ask you a quick question about GB Energy, because we've been watching all morning this interview that Jürgen Mayer did yesterday with Sky, in which he basically confessed that they don't have a plan to create any jobs at all at the moment, but hopefully in 5 years they might have a couple of hundred, not the 1,000 that he promised. And as far as the £300 saving on your energy bill is concerned, he's got no idea, because that's not in his remit, apparently.
No, well, it's all rather falling apart, isn't it? Well, I mean, Ed Miliband's promised to save us £300 a year on our energy bills. That is going to be a real millstone around the whole government's neck, because it's quite clear he has no idea how this saving is going to be achieved, and quite the opposite. The trying to decarbonise the electricity grid by 2030 is going to hugely increase energy bills, because it's going to require billions of pounds of investment, and it's going to require the government to run two parallel sort of energy systems, wind and solar for when the sun's shining, the wind's blowing, and then we're going to have all this gas backup. As many gas power stations as we have now are going to be kept in backup, in reserve, on standby, in case, for when the sun goes in. I mean, it's completely ridiculously expensive way to run an energy system. And I mean, Britain's already one of the countries in the world which generates one of the highest proportions of its electricity from wind and solar already. So if wind and solar energy was going to save us money, it would already be saving us money. But instead, we've got the highest energy prices in the world. So something doesn't quite add up. And the idea that you can sort of get an even better deal for taxpayers and energy consumers by nationalising the whole thing is completely ridiculous. I mean, wind and solar companies are now sort of, a bit on their uppers, because the cost of constructing wind and solar farms has increased quite dramatically in recent years. They're not making good profits on it. And
but they don't have to worry about that, because we just give them the money to build them, don't we?
Well, the idea that the sort of nationalised version of the industry can do better is completely bizarre.
Yeah, absolutely right. Which also brings us back to Keir Starmer in your column this morning in The Sun on page 12. Entangle ourselves in the EU again. No merci, Mr. Macron. Emmanuel Macron has got some stones, it has to be said, and some chutzpah to bother actually telling anybody that anything has failed other than his own government. The idea that he's, pulled Keir Starmer aside and said, Brexit has failed, it's time to do a new deal. I don't know what happened last night at the dinner, but most of the trip seemed to focus around, sort of security and defence. He went to NATO, gave a very boring press conference, and then he got very tetchy with a Sun journalist about whether he broke COVID rules with his voice coach. But any idea what sort of cosy deal he did last night over dinner in the French or in the Brussels capital?
No, well, what he went to do there is, as you say, discuss defence and security pact with the EU, particularly in light of what's happening in Ukraine. Donald Trump has sort of indicated he might want to settle the Ukraine war and allow Putin possibly to walk off with some kind of victory. And Keir Starmer's very worried about that, and wants a rational response from the EU as a whole, so a coordinated response. So he wants to cooperate with the EU in that sphere. But Macron seemed to get it into his head that Starmer was coming to Brussels with his tail wagging between his legs and begging to be sort of let back into the EU in some sort of form. It's not hard really to see why the EU should be at the moment trying to entice Britain into some kind of customs union. Because, across the Atlantic, we've got Donald Trump is threatening Mexico, Canada, China with tariffs. He's threatening Britain and the EU with tariffs. But what he has said is that Britain, he feels he can do a deal with Britain to avert this punitive tariffs, but he doesn't feel he can do a deal with the EU. And where would that leave Britain? In this sort of privileged position of possibly being able to trade virtually fairly freely with both the US and the EU. And so, what the EU wants to do is try to trap Britain in the EU customs union, so that we wouldn't be able to do any kind of deal with the US.
Right. So, I mean, all in all, it was a bit of a wasted trip, really, wasn't it? I mean, as everybody kind of looks towards the US, because it's the place where everything seems to be happening at the moment, the long-threatened, tariff destruction of the world didn't really happen. In fact, quite the reverse. Mexico agreed to put more troops on the border, which is what Trump wanted. So he's delayed the tariffs for a month. The Canadians are starting to buckle under as well. I mean, yeah, the markets were a bit wobbly, but I mean, the markets will see any kind of change in anything as an opportunity to make money one way or the other. He seems to be looking in the wrong direction, it seems to me, Mr. Starmer.
Well, yes, I mean, Trump sort of uses these sort of tariffs as a sort of, outrageous opening position in negotiations, and I mean, I don't think he really wants permanent tariffs against Mexico, Canada, and so on. He wants something out the deal, and
Right.
the EU has been a master in what we call non-tariff barriers, and this sort of spurious bans on chlorinated chicken and the like, which are sort of dressed up as health and safety messages, things, but are really there to protect French farmers and the like. So that's what's going on with trade. But yeah, I mean the EU. I mean, you look at the US. It's far more open trade. If you look at US tariffs, they're far lower than almost every country in the world. The US believes in free trade in a way that the EU doesn't believe in free trade. And it's not surprising that Trump should want to sort of put this right and get rid of these sort of non-tariff barriers.
Yeah, exactly right. It's going to be an interesting few weeks and months, it seems to me, because he's called the EU atrocious and way out of line when it comes to the trade deficit that he's got with them. $350 billion, I think he said it was. They don't buy any of our stuff, but we buy plenty of their stuff. So we'll see how it all goes. And I mean, I wonder whether we'll see Keir Starmer going over to Washington anytime soon, because so far he doesn't appear to be getting an invitation.
No, traditionally, US presidents have sort of invited, met up with British prime ministers, among their first visits. But this occasion, Trump seems to have a distinctly cooler attitude towards Starmer. Now, Starmer's got to choose, really. He said, of course, we want to trade with everybody, but he's really being forced into a position where he's going to side either with the EU or with the US, or certainly to avoid siding with the EU. And I think to be fair to him at the moment, he has shown no sign of falling for the EU's ruse and sort of accepting any invitation to rejoin the EU customs union. I mean, Yvette Cooper too made that clear yesterday morning. So yeah, I mean, at the moment, it seems that the government is quite resistant to the idea of being drawn back into the tentacles of the EU and having to obey all their regulations and so on. But we've got to remember the Labour Party was pretty heavily Remain, and Starmer himself was a great advocate of a second referendum trying to thwart it. So
for a long time as
I don't feel we can necessarily trust Starmer not to fall for the EU's overtures and sort of end up getting Britain trapped back in the sort of EU sphere of influence.
No, absolutely right. Ross, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Ross Clark's column in The Sun today on page 12.